This is the port of Fujairah, the port the UAE built into an escape route around the Strait of Hormuz. But here is the problem. The more Fujairah works, the more dangerous it becomes. Because this port sits outside Hormuz, on the open water of the Gulf of Oman. That is why the UAE spent billions connecting it to Abu Dhabi's oil fields through ADCOP, a pipeline designed to keep crude moving if the strait ever became too dangerous. But ADCOP was never meant to replace Hormuz. It was meant to buy time. And once Fujairah starts carrying the weight of a real crisis, it stops being just a backup plan. It becomes the new pressure point. So by the end of this, you will understand why the UAE's escape route around Hormuz might be one of the smartest energy moves in the Gulf, and also one of the most dangerous. On paper, Fujairah looks like a small emirate on the UAE's eastern coastline. But in energy security terms, it is one of the most strategically important pieces of coastal real estate on the planet. It sits on the Gulf of Oman, outside the Strait of Hormuz, facing the open water of the Indian Ocean. And that single geographic fact is why the UAE has spent years turning it into the endpoint of its survival strategy by building a single pipeline system. The pipeline I'm talking about is the Abu Dhabi Crude Oil Pipeline, ADCOP, and it went online in 2012. With a capacity of about 1.5 million barrels per day. You can start to see why one pipeline was never going to be a complete answer to the geography problem every Gulf producer is quietly trying to solve. But let's talk about where that pipeline ends up, because that's where the real story is. Fujairah matters because of where it sits. On the Gulf of Oman, about 70 nautical miles from the Strait of Hormuz, but outside it. That means any tanker anchored there has already cleared the Chokepoint and is in open water, ready to sail to China, India, Japan, South Korea, or any other crude buyer. That single geographic fact, Fujairah faces the Indian Ocean, not the Persian Gulf, is why the port matters so much right now. The port did not become a global energy hub by accident. Its strategic value became clear during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, when Iranian forces mined Gulf waters and tankers became targets. That was when the world began to understand that the Strait of Hormuz was not guaranteed to stay open. Shipping companies and oil traders started looking for alternatives, and Fujairah, positioned on the UAE's open ocean side, was already in the right place. Storage at Fujairah has grown from about 550,000 cubic meters in 1994 to nearly 18 million cubic meters today. That makes it the Middle East's largest commercial storage hub for refined and crude oil. The reason is simple. Every time tensions rise in the Gulf, companies want more oil storage on the safe side of Hormuz. Fujairah's key infrastructure has grown with its storage capacity. What began as 370 meters of berths is now more than 9.5 kilometers of quayside, built to handle very large crude carriers, LNG tankers, container ships, and bulk vessels. It is also one of the world's top bunkering hubs, meaning ships stop there to refuel. So Fujairah is not just a backup route for crude in a crisis. It is a port thousands of vessels rely on to keep moving between Asia and Europe. What you have is a layered energy hub, a pipeline bringing crude from Abu Dhabi's interior, massive storage tanks holding millions of barrels, loading terminals moving that crude onto tankers, and a bunkering operation fueling the global merchant fleet. All of it sits outside the Strait of Hormuz, on open water, which makes it even more important whenever the Persian Gulf's exit route comes under threat. There is another reason Fujairah matters that often gets missed. It is not just about crude exports. It is also about flexibility. Oil stored at Fujairah can be blended, held, redirected, or loaded, depending on market conditions and security risks. In a normal market, that makes Fujairah commercially useful. In a crisis, it becomes strategically useful. If tankers cannot safely enter the Persian Gulf, Cargoes already sitting outside Hormuz become much more valuable because they can move without waiting for the strait to reopen. That gives the UAE something most Gulf producers do not have: the ability to separate at least part of its export system from the most dangerous maritime choke point in the world. But this also changes how a crisis would unfold. If Hormuz became unsafe, the first impact would not just be a shortage of oil. It would be congestion. Tankers would reroute, insurance costs would spike, buyers would compete for available cargoes, and every barrel already positioned outside the strait would become more important. Fujairah would suddenly have to absorb more traffic, more storage demand, more military attention, and more market pressure all at once. That is the paradox. The stronger Fujairah becomes as an alternative, the more pressure the system places on it during a crisis. Its value is exactly what makes it vulnerable. Now here's where it gets complicated. The UAE is also fast-tracking a new west-east pipeline, expected around 2027 to complement ADCOP. Once online, it could roughly double Fujairah's crude export capacity to about 3.6 million barrels per day. That sounds huge, but it is still less than 1/5 of the roughly 20 million barrels a day that normally moved through Hormuz before the crisis. The problem is that once Fujairah becomes the backup plan, it also becomes a target. In 2026, drone attacks and falling debris around Fujairah caused fires, reported damage to storage infrastructure, and at least some suspension of oil loading operations. Suddenly, the world's backup route for its most important oil choke point had a choke point problem of its own. Other Gulf states have limited alternatives. Saudi Arabia has its east-west pipeline to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, with a theoretical capacity of around 7 million barrels per day. Though reported Iranian strikes in 2026 showed that overland pipelines are vulnerable too. Qatar, Kuwait, Iraq, and Bahrain depend almost entirely on Hormuz. Iran threatens the strait, but still exports most of its own crude from Karg Island inside the Gulf. Oman sits outside the strait, but lacks the pipeline network needed to serve as a major outlet for other producers. And this is why Fujairah should not be understood as a simple bypass. A bypass suggests that the problem has been solved. Fujairah does something narrower, but more important. It changes the UAE's crisis options. Without ADCOP and Fujairah, Abu Dhabi's oil exports would be trapped inside the same maritime geography as everyone else. With them, the UAE can keep part of its system functioning even if Hormuz is threatened. That does not remove the risk, but it changes the balance of risk. It gives the UAE more time, more bargaining power, and more resilience than most of its neighbors. What Fujairah actually gives the UAE isn't a clean replacement for the Strait of Hormuz. It's more like a pressure valve, a way to keep enough oil moving for long enough to avoid a complete collapse of export revenues while diplomacy or military outcomes resolve whatever crisis has made Hormuz dangerous. And with the second pipeline expected around 2027, the UAE is making that pressure valve as large and as capable as it possibly can. Because in a region where geography has always been destiny, the only thing better than having a backup is having a backup that nobody can afford to ignore.